everyone, and welcome back. Today, we're jumping right into this explainer to re-examine what's honestly one of the most famous scientific mysteries out there, the hard problem of consciousness. But here's the twist. We're looking at a fascinating paper that suggests this whole thing, it might not actually be some timeless mystery of the universe at all. Instead, it might just be a massive historical typo.
Seriously, think about that for a second. What if we've spent centuries trying to patch a bug that we accidentally coded into philosophy ourselves? The author makes this wild argument that our modern confusion about consciousness isn't because the brain is impossibly magical, it's because a few hundred years ago we fundamentally changed the starting point of how we explain reality. And then we literally just forgot that we made the change.
So here's our roadmap for today. 1. The hard problem. 2. A historical software bug. 3. Rethinking the starting line. 4. The building blocks of life. 5. A new definition of consciousness. And 6. Stress testing the theory. All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the hard problem of consciousness. So the crux of the problem as the scientific community sees it today is this. How does isolated, dead material somehow magically produce the rich inner feeling of being alive? Now, science is absolutely amazing at what we call the easy problems, right? Things like explaining how the brain processes light or how it fires a signal to move a muscle. But the hard problem comes in when we ask, why does it actually feel like something to see the color red or taste a sweet strawberry? I mean, why aren't we all just biological robots operating in the dark? The baseline assumption we usually make is that we start with dead, lifeless matter, and then somehow consciousness just magically pops out at the very end of the assembly line. Which brings us to Section 2, a historical software bug, or the explanatory error. This historical shift perfectly illustrates how the modern world completely flipped the ancient script. It turned consciousness into this bizarre leftover that we suddenly have to explain. You see, the modern inversion starts with matter, then it turns it into a mechanism, builds a brain out of it, and then is left with a giant question mark for consciousness. But the earlier order? Well, it started with relationships, life, and knowing first. Back then, experience wasn't some unsolvable mystery. It was just what it felt like to be an organized, living participant in a meaningful world. Let's trace how this built up historically, as we fell so head over heels in love with measuring individual parts that we totally forgot how to measure the whole. It really kicked off around the 16th and 17th centuries. You had Bacon giving us observation, Galileo showing us the universe could be measured with math, Descartes came along and split the mind and the body, Newton unified the laws of physical motion, and eventually thinkers like Lamartine concluded that man was essentially just a machine. Now, make no mistake, these were incredible, world-changing scientific successes. But as the paper points out, they caused a massive explanatory overextension. We took a method that was absolutely brilliant for measuring rocks and planetary orbits, and we just started assuming it was the only way to explain living, breathing human beings. We've got to realize that just because the mechanical method is incredibly successful at measuring things, it definitely doesn't mean the entire universe is just a machine. The paper uses this fantastic analogy. Science is a brilliant hammer. But if you try to eat a bowl of soup with a hammer, well, you're going to have a really bad time. By treating the whole universe as cold mechanical parts, we accidentally squeeze the living person right out of the picture. And when we tried to cram human experience back in later, it just didn't fit. Okay, so moving on to Section 3, rethinking the starting line and changing the order. If the machine model is fundamentally broken for consciousness, how do we fix the glitch and restart? We actually have to look backward to classical thinkers like Euclid, who understood that you simply can't break everything down into isolated fragments. Ancient philosophers didn't look at a human being and see a random pile of atoms. They saw an organized, cohesive form. I absolutely love this concept from Euclid. The whole is greater than the part, because it perfectly captures how a living organism is so much more than just a pile of isolated chemistry. A living being actively maintains itself, right? Think about it. If you take a clock apart, you still have clock parts. But if you take an organism apart, you don't have organism parts anymore. You just have a mess, because you've destroyed the very organization that made it alive in the first place. Notice how the earlier order here starts with existence and relationships. It completely bypasses the trap of trying to squeeze feelings out of dead matter. Before modern philosophy took over, thinkers used words like soul, breath, heart, and spirit. They started their whole framework with the whole, living person interacting with the world. You didn't have a ghost trapped in a meat machine, you just had a living participant. To illustrate this, the author neutrally uses the historical life record of Jesus as a fascinating data set to demonstrate how relationships, things like speech and touch, actually change our fundamental state of being.
Regardless of theology, the Gospels provide a massive pre-modern record of how humans interact. And what do we see in those accounts? People aren't treated as isolated biological robots. When someone is spoken to or touched or truly seen, their reality literally changes. Their entire future trajectory is altered. The paper points out that this proves an underlying ancient rule: relation precedes state change. Basically, what happens between people fundamentally changes what they become.
So let's dive into Section 4, the building blocks of life and deriving life from scratch. Let's toss out the old assumptions and literally derive reality step by step using these Lego blocks of life. Let's walk through it. Step 1, things relate. Nothing exists in total isolation. Step 2, invariance. Some things persist through all that change. Step 3, we get life, which the author wonderfully describes as active self-maintenance. It's basically the art of a cell working really, really hard not to dissolve into goo. And because a living thing has to fight to stay alive, it naturally has to care. A rock doesn't care if it gets smashed, but a cell cares if it runs out of nutrients. That caring brings us to step 4, waiting. Suddenly, the world isn't just a flat spreadsheet of facts. It's a dynamic landscape of things that actually matter for survival. To put it simply, searching for consciousness inside a brain cell is exactly like looking for the fun of a birthday party inside an egg. You're staring at the ingredients, not the event itself. The author's analogy here is just spot on. Brains and chemicals are entirely necessary for sure. They are the cake. But the experience of life is the party. It happens when living participants interact with their environment. You can't put a slice of cake under a microscope to find out why the party was fun. Which perfectly sets up Section 5, a new definition of consciousness. We are finally ready to answer the big question. This brings us to the core idea of the paper. Consciousness isn't some magical ghost in the machine. Rather, it's what it feels like from the inside to be an active, living participant in a meaningful world. Now, I know that's a pretty dense definition, but look at how it completely sidesteps the whole hard problem. We aren't asking dead matter to suddenly wake up. We're saying that once you have a living organism that has to fight to stay alive, and it actually cares about the things around it, consciousness is simply the internal feeling of doing that work. When we break this dense definition down a bit more, it brilliantly illustrates how everyday experiences like playing a video game or flinching from a hot pan are really just weighted relationships in action. Think about it. You aren't a blank screen. Experiences hold together in coherence. They aren't just random sparks. They're weighted, meaning we care about some things more than others. We remember where the danger is. We know what treasure is worth grabbing, and we actively anticipate the future across time. Consciousness is just what it feels like to be you, as a living, self-maintaining organism moving through a relational world where things actually matter. Let's move to our final part, Section 6, stress testing the theory with some edge cases. Let's dive into some of these edge cases to see if this new theory actually holds water. This breakdown perfectly highlights why a rock or even a hyper-sophisticated AI language model isn't conscious. They don't have their own bodies that they're desperately trying to keep alive. A thermostat reacts to heat, sure, but it doesn't care. Its purpose was given to it by us. AI is an incredibly impressive word machine, but it has borrowed stakes. It isn't trying to prevent itself from biological death. But a living cell, it has intrinsic stakes. It is fighting to survive. That biological self-maintenance is the absolute ground-level prerequisite for consciousness. This framework also neatly explains why a wedding ring is so much more than just a piece of metal. Its relational weight completely overrides its material chemistry. If we look at other edge cases, dreams, they're just your brain internally weighting relations while you sleep, even without external stimuli. Anesthesia, it simply disrupts the coherence of the participant temporarily. And symbols, like a flag or that wedding ring, prove that our reality isn't just about material chemistry. A piece of paper magically becomes a $100 bill purely because of our shared relational meaning. So here's the big takeaway. We've successfully removed the hard problem by proving you don't need to magically squeeze feelings out of dead matter, as long as you start with living relationships. Look, matter is real. Physics is absolutely real. But matter alone isn't the whole story. Once you realize that life is an organized relationship and consciousness is literally just what it feels like to live out those relationships, that grand, impossible mystery, it completely dissolves. I really want to leave you with this provocative thought today. Because if our minds are genuinely built on living relationships rather than just cold, isolated matter, how does that fundamentally change the way we treat each other? If we are truly defined by how we relate to the world around us, then the connections we make are literally the fabric of our consciousness. If this paper is right, we aren't just isolated machines bumping into one another in the dark. We are living participants, and the way we speak, touch, and pay attention to one another actually builds the reality we experience. It's a completely different, incredibly empowering way to look at the universe, and I really hope it gave you something incredible to think about today.